All I require is to sit in the sun, read my book, alone.
I will leave you now to your book.
That is all I ask.
Books, young man, books, thousands of them. If time wasn't so important, I'd show you something. My library, thousands of books.
Hi, my name is Peter, and I'm the host of this Trek Book Club podcast. This is a companion podcast to the Trek Book Club on Twitter, where we read and discuss Trek books approximately every 6 weeks. To learn more about the club, go to @Trek Book Club on Twitter. For this episode, we are going to try something a little different. This will be the first Trek Book Club member spotlight episode, in which I will have a conversation, an interview, and just chat with a fellow Trek Book Club member about Trek novels, specific Trek interests, and the franchise in general. Unlike past episodes on the pod, we won't be analyzing a specific Trek novel. This is the first time we are doing this style of episode, so it can be considered a proof of concept. If this approach is popular and of interest, I will have more of these member spotlight episodes in the future. We are recording this episode after the Strange New World Season 2 finale, Hegemony. So this is a warning that we may discuss spoilers related to Strange New Worlds, as well as touch upon other episodes and novels in the Star Trek universe. My guest for today is Martyn, who is the creator of the DS9 fan fiction website called DS9 Continuing. DS9 Continuing focuses on hypothetical seasons 8 to 14 of Deep Space Nine. Hi, Martyn. Welcome to the pod, and thanks for joining me on this first member spotlight episode.
Hello, Peter. Thank you very much for having me.
We ask our first-time guests to give their Trek origin story and Trek novel origin story. So can you start us off with telling us your Trek and Trek book origin stories?
Yes. I think probably one of my earliest memories is Pike in the chair with one blink for yes and two for no. Not that I'm old enough to have actually seen that in the first run, of course. It must have been a rerun of some kind. And then I remember that at primary school one day when I must have only been 9 or 10 or something, it was, one of those last days of term and they just put a movie on to entertain us because we're not going to be doing any work anyway. And that movie was Search for Spock. And then Next Generation came around, of course, and we're in the UK, so we didn't get it as it came out. But one of my friends had a satellite dish and a VHS recorder, so the tapes got passed around all over the place. And so it just kind of went on from there. And my friends were the nerd group at school anyway, so we were reading comic books and watching all the sci-fi shows. So that's where that came from.
Star Trek III: The Search for Spock was my first Star Trek movie that I saw as well.
I remember when I think they cut it off before the end, actually, and we were all like, no, we have to know how it finishes, and we had to come back after the next term and all of that.
Oh, really? They didn't show the conclusion of the movie?
I don't think so, no.
Well, I guess that's one way for the teachers to get the kids to come back.
Yeah.
Great. And how did you get into Star Trek novels? Do you any recollection of your early novels that you've read?
Again, yes. I think I got out some from the library when I was really young. Some of the earlier ones, there was like Spock's World, The Romulan Way, Vendetta. That's a very famous, well-known one. And so I got those out of the library and I would read those. But I wasn't like a dedicated follower at that point. But then Avatar came out, which was the first so-called DS9 relaunch book that came out in 2001. And that's what made me into a semi-religious follower of them, because it was doing what the books had never been able to do before. Because there was no more Deep Space Nine on screen, and Next Generation was focusing on the movies, and Voyager was on the other side of the galaxy, these Deep Space Nine books could actually make changes to the status quo and introduce new recurring characters and continue the story, the continuing story, beyond the books. So that is what I found fascinating about them, and kept buying every single one, kept up with it followed that storyline as it went on.
You saw DS9, the first 7 seasons when it
Oh,
was
yes, yeah,
initially broadcast. Did you have like favorite character or favorite plot line in DS9? Because
favorite characters were definitely Kira and Odo to start with. I liked that they weren't, they could break out of the slightly bland Starfleet mold that Next Generation had put in. They could be more interesting, more dimensioned characters. I'm not sure if that's even a word. And I loved that Kira, she was angry and she had every right to be, and that anger was respected. She was never looked down on for that. She was a very strong and powerful character, but that wasn't all she was. She wasn't just angry. She had her romantic side, she had her faith. I loved that she was just completely incapable of backing down from a fight, especially with a Cardassian. I mean, her scenes with Dukat are just phenomenal. I love that. And then also Odo, I was amused by the fact that he was such a grumpy old man a lot of the time. But also I connected to kind of his shy and awkward side and his storyline about his unrequited love for Kira. That definitely struck a chord with me. So, yeah, those two I'd say are my favorites.
And actually, Odo is my favorite DS9 main character as well. So I really enjoyed him.
Yeah.
I enjoyed Kira. Garrick is my favorite recurring character on the show.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you on that.
So let's dive in a little bit to DS9 continuing. So maybe you can give our listeners like introduction to what the website is and how you wrote all the screenplays and scripts, and where did the idea for the website come from?
Well, it was originally because when these, I'd say they were colloquially called the DS9 relaunch, the writers and the editors didn't like that, but it's kind of just what caught on. But the idea was continuing on the story after the actual TV show had ended. And they were so well regarded, and it definitely felt like just more Deep Space Nine. It felt so familiar and comfortable, and it was just like the show, that people started calling it Season 8 of the show. And that went on for a while, and eventually I just thought, okay, well, what if it actually is Season 8? If I convert and adapt these novels into screenplays as if they're just more episodes of the show. And I'd not actually done that before. It was the first time I'd tried writing in screenplay format. I'd done some writing before that, but not as that. So I didn't have any actual formal training in how to write screenplays. I had done some writing before, and my degree is in English language. So I have some idea of what I'm doing, but just not in that format. So I kind of learned by reading the actual Deep Space Nine scripts that are available on the internet. You can track those down somewhere. Things like Babylon 5 and Buffy and some other of those similar kind of shows. So a lot of the idea of me doing this was just sort of for my own entertainment, for me to learn how to do this through just by doing it. And I never originally intended to actually put them online. It was just for my own entertainment, as I say. And I didn't want to get into trouble with Paramount or Pocket Books by putting other people's work on the internet for free, obviously. And I know it's not exactly the same, but it was clearly the same story that I was adapting into screenplay format. So I didn't want to get into trouble for that. And so I wrote Season 8, which I don't know if you're familiar with the books, but that was from Avatar in 2001 to Unity in 2003. The arc that had formed, that was clearly like a season premiere and a season finale, the way that was arranged in the books. And then it carried on into Season 9 as well, where there was a whole new arc that started with the world of DS9 short stories or novellas and ended with a big arc around the Mirror Universe with a few books there. But at the end of that, the end of The Soul Key was the last book in 2009, there was some upheaval at the editors then. The editor who was in charge of the Deep Space Nine line wasn't working there anymore, and so the books just kind of stopped. And a different editor came in and they had some different ideas, and so the book started again, but there'd been a big gap in the storyline of a few years worth of story. and we didn't know what had happened in the middle of it, and it had left on a bit of a cliffhanger, and everybody was asking, what happened in this gap in the Deep Space Nine books? So eventually I just decided to answer that question for myself. And because I'd already done seasons 8 and 9 in screenplay format, I just carried on in screenplay format when I was doing what I decided to call season 10. And season 10 was the first one that I actually made public for other people to read on the internet because they wanted to know what happened. So I told them.
When it comes to DS9 novel, I only read the first few. So I read Avatar, the Section 31 one.
Right,
Abyss, yes, I read that one. And I think I read like one or two. The last one I read was Mission Gamma 1.
That's Twilight, it's called.
Twilight, yes. So that was my extent of the relaunch novel so far.
Right.
But to prepare for this podcast, I thank you for recommending reading some of the screenplays throughout the 7 seasons. One thing I noticed that I enjoyed is that you had a lot of variety of styles of episodes or screenplays. So there were some humorous ones, there were some serious ones, action ones, social issues. How did you balance all the different types of stories that's available out there as you continue progressing through the 7th season?
Yeah, well, that was exactly the goal. I wanted it to just feel like more episodes of the show, like Deep Space Nine itself had continued. So yeah, I did deliberately try to make sure there was a variety of types of stories in there. And when I was adapting the existing novels for seasons 8 and 9, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to put like the more light-hearted episodes in there because in a novel you don't really get that very much. It's got to be a bigger subject, a heavy subject to write a novel about. So when I started coming up with my own ideas to fill those gaps in season 10, I definitely did make sure that there was some lighter, even flat-out comedy episodes, like you say. In season 10, the main comedy one is called The Case of the Flamping Flurble.
Yes. And that's one of my favorites.
That was just trying to do like a Scooby-Doo episode, basically, in Star Trek, because you've got like the 5 teenager characters almost going away on having an adventure and getting into trouble. And then in season 11, I had an episode that was called The Late Show with Morn, where the main gag is the fact that the guy who's never allowed to speak on screen now has his own chat show. The big thing on the station at the moment is Morn's chat show. Everybody wants tickets to Morn's chat show. So many different ways of making him not speak on screen. You know, I had fun playing around with that and different kinds of chat shows. Like I had an Oprah section and a Jerry Springer section and things like that. And then in season 12, the comedy one I had there was called A Bear, A Very Little Brain. And basically it's Bashir's teddy bear, Kukulaka, goes on an adventure around the station. So I have these little sort of silly ones in there, but of course the harder hitting ones, the storyline that they ended the cliffhanger on in season 9 was about the Ascendants. And these are a new villain in the Gamma Quadrant. Now that we're kind of sort of almost friends with the Dominion, they needed a new bad guy in the Gamma Quadrant. And so over the course of seasons 8 and 9, just very slowly, subtly in the background, they've been building up these Ascendants as the new guys. And then, just when it seemed like that storyline was about to properly get going, that's when this cliffhanger happened. And when the books came back later on, that had apparently already happened, whatever it was, with the Ascendants, and we didn't look like we were ever going to go back and find out what had happened. So that was a big part of what I was filling in season 10. And so I needed to have some major dramatic moments in there and big, enormous battle scenes. There's a 17-page battle scene in that episode, Heresy. That's one of the main focus ones there. And with season 10, when I wrote that, I thought it was the only one I was going to do. So I wanted to make sure that all my possible ideas were crammed in there, all the different kinds of things. I had an episode called Inside Out, where it's literally just 2 people sat on a bench talking for the entire hour. Vaughn and Roe have a conversation in which they reveal both of their backstories and plan what they're going to do for the future with all the secret missions about Section 31 and things like that. So that was literally just two people talking. But sometimes if they've got interesting things to say, I always feel like that can be a very exciting episode, even with no action in it.
I mean, Star Trek over the years has had those types of stage plays ones. The one that jumped out to me when I was reading Inside Out was TOS's The Empath, which was with Jem, kind of a stage play style, the way that it was, the script and the story in the film, with just Jem and Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, just the four of them. And that was pretty much most of the story.
I wanted to make sure that it had all of those different kind of storylines in. But then, as I say, I kind of originally intended to finish it with season 10. That was the plan, at least. But then, of course, more storylines started popping up in my head, and there were things that I hadn't been able to fit in at the end of season 10 that I'd originally wanted to. So I started having more ideas. And then, of course, the actual official licensed books had come back by that point. So I had something to build towards, where I'd seen they were going with the storylines in the future. I now had something to aim for, so I could start building the storyline and filling the gaps in again there. And some of the other ideas that they'd come up with for the official books, I could start layering in and explaining how we got there.
So was that the impetus for season 11 and 12?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, season 11, I think, is a season that's very much about transition, because the first 3 seasons of it had been with one senior crew, where you had Kira and Vaughn and Dax and Nog and Shar and those characters. And then I knew that the last 3 seasons were going to be a whole different crew that we'd seen in these future books, where Ro is now in command of the station, and her first officer is Major Sen, who is another Bajoran militia character. And John Candlewood was suddenly the chief science officer instead of Shar, and various other people like that. There was a security chief called Evik Nath, who was a Bajoran in Starfleet. So there was a whole separate crew, really, in that last half of it. So season 11 was definitely a transitional year of figuring out how we got there. But also, all the way back to Avatar, the first book of the Deep Space Nine relaunch, we'd been told that Rebecca, Sisko's baby daughter, was in some way important to the Bajoran religion. And so I didn't really think we'd ever really dealt with that storyline. So that was the one that I wanted to focus on in season 11. And the conflict between the various religions on Bajor, now that we've got the mainstream Bajoran religion, but we've also got these alternative ones. We've got the Ohalavaru, which came about because of the book of Ohalu that was discovered in Avatar. And then there is the Cardassian religion came into it as well, the Oralian Way. And there was the Ascendants version of it, because they also worshipped the prophets, but their interpretation of it was much more violent, and they made it into a crusade. They were like Knights Templar. And so that was part of the idea of the conflict between all these different interpretations, even though they actually all worshipped the same gods.
Related to religion, that was one of the aspects of DS9 which made that show unique compared to TOS, TNG, Voyager, etc. So it was nice that you continued to develop it and bring in other variations and other types of religions into the story, since that was something unique to the show.
Well, I've found that interesting for my own sake. I'm not a religious person myself, but writing from the perspective of people like Kira and Sen, who clearly are religious, but then also from the perspective of people like Vaughn and Ro, who aren't, and sort of having those conversations, those arguments between those characters, helped me to work through those issues myself in my own head as I was writing it. So I found that very interesting as I was doing that.
The exercise of writing it also helped you in your own personal path related to religion.
Yeah, I would say so.
And then you had season 12, which
Yeah.
title I think was called Destiny, which connects to my favorite Star Trek novel series, the Destiny trilogy by David Mack. So
Yes, very much so. I know we've discussed that online, haven't we, on the Trek Book Club Twitter? So
yeah,
that was obviously a huge, momentous event in the Star Trek universe, in where lots of different series were all crossing over. There was DS9, there was Next Generation, there was this new one called Titan, which was following Riker's ship after Nemesis when he got his own command at last. So the thing about the Destiny novels, though, is because at the time they wrote them, at the time David Mack wrote them, he didn't really know what was going to be happening with the Deep Space Nine story. It was still in that sort of fallow period where they hadn't actually come back to it. So the only involvement of the DS9 crew in the Destiny trilogy was Dax on the Aventine. She's been promoted. She's now the captain of this starship called the Aventine. So I needed to figure out, what are the rest of them doing? If I'm writing this from Deep Space Nine's perspective, I've got to now figure out, what are these people doing? Because it still has to be something interesting to watch and read about. These are interesting characters. It's got to be something important. But at the same time, it can't be something too important, because the storyline from the books is what it is, and Dax is the main mover of a lot of that that's going on in there. So I was like, well, what can these people do then? What do Kira and Sisko and Vaughn actually do in this storyline? So that was something interesting to try to figure out.
When I was reading Destiny, I was also wondering what was happening to the DS9 crew, because like you said, we saw Captain Dax of the Aventine, but we didn't really see the others. Did you have any challenges or hurdles when you were trying to incorporate DS9 characters into the Destiny events, but almost like on the side without affecting the Destiny events directly?
Yeah. Well, that I had to sort of go with that and make that what I was working with, so that Ro and Kira at Bajor and on DS9, I was writing them from the perspective of people who can see this happening in the distance, this massive apocalyptic invasion going on, but they can't do anything about it. They're not involved in it. It's over there. It's not over here, but it's coming towards us. I mean, I went to the Churchill War Rooms in London, and going there just gave me an idea for this map of Federation space where you can see the Borg advance moving slowly over the Federation space, and getting closer and closer and closer, and more worried as you see it coming your way. What can we do about this? We're a stationary space station. There's nothing we can do. We can't run. We're stuck here. How are we supposed to defend a planet when we're literally just an immobile space station? These kind of things. That's what I was trying to write about with those characters. And also, in doing so, tie it into their ongoing character arcs as well. It wasn't just about plot and explosions and blowing stuff up. It was about the people involved in this. So I used what was happening out there to affect Ro and Kira's characters.
I just wanted to mention that the Duty Calls, which was the screenplay you recommended to me, I really liked that one. That came from the Destiny season, and it was really exciting. It harkens back to some of the classic DS9, even though it's a bit of more of an action / battle screenplay. It was really, really exciting, similar to
that one. Yeah, that episode is because when we started the Destiny trilogy, Dax was already in command of the Aventine. We'd been told that there'd been a massive battle, and her captain and first officer had been killed in the battle, and she'd been promoted 2 ranks and taken over the ship. So I just wanted to see that battle, see what happened, see her get promoted in that way. So that was what that episode was about.
No, I really enjoyed reading that one then. A little bit of a semi-tangent, but you mentioned the War Rooms in England. I just wanted to mention, recently I actually visited the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Library and Museum up in New York, and they actually had a replica of a room that the U.S. had that monitored the fighting and the war fronts during
Yeah.
World War II. So it was interesting to see that type of
Yeah, that's where I got
room
that
that was
idea
going on.
from. And applying things from the real world into Star Trek and putting it in a sci-fi setting is, of course, a lot of what goes on in Star Trek anyway, isn't it?
And then we have season 13, the Typhon Pact. I haven't read the Typhon Pact novels yet, but I know it's a major series also that had a lot of books that talks about the post-Destiny situation
Yeah.
in the Alpha Quadrant. Yeah.
Well, what happens in the Typhon Pact is after the Borg invasion, these other smaller nations around the Alpha and Beta quadrants that we've heard of but not really spent much time with, have not had much development, they all decide to band together and make their own version of the Khitomer Accords, which they call the Typhon Pact. And that is the Romulans that we are familiar with already, of course, but also the Tzenkethi, who were mentioned a couple of times in Deep Space Nine, the Tholians, who were mentioned in the original series and in Enterprise, the Gorn, who of course we've just seen in Strange New Worlds, the Breen, who are the ones from Deep Space Nine with the helmets and the buzzy voices, and another one called the Kinshire, who I think are only from the books. They've not been seen on the TV. But they all banded together, and the idea there was not to be a military antagonist to the Federation, but to be more of a political antagonist, because they were making alliances and just building a larger state and a larger state and more people joining up. And so the Federation had to do similar to counter that. We've already got the Federation and the Klingons in the Khitomer Accords. So they started talking to the Ferengi and the Cardassians and even the Talarians, I don't know if you remember those from a Next Generation episode, to try to build this counter political force in the quadrant as well. So that was an interesting aspect of what was going on in season 13, to see that sort of brinkmanship of we're moving here, we're getting this new ally, and we're doing this over here on this side, and so we're getting a new ally as well, and who's the bigger alliance, and that kind of comparison, so that it's not just another battle, it's a different kind of conflict.
I think somewhere around that era, was it the Articles of Federation, which is more of a political novel, came out?
Yeah. Well, I actually ended up putting that in season 12 rather than season 13. But yeah, it's around the same area.
It's around there. Actually, now that I think about it, the one novel in that era I did read was A Singular Destiny, which is a prequel to Typhon Pact.
Yeah.
It was kind of it's along the same line, and it led to the events in the Typhon Pact series. So that was an interesting one too.
But also what had happened in season 13 was that because of the Borg invasion, there were a lot of refugees, of course. Worlds had been destroyed. There were people just on the run in ships everywhere. And because it had been established that Bajor was one of the worlds that had not been attacked, the Borg had turned around before they got to Bajor. That meant that Bajor was now going to have to be one of the worlds that would be taking on all of these refugees. They're a Federation member now, and therefore they've got to take on all these refugees. So I thought, well, there's my storyline for season 13, dealing with these issues. And again, that's a real world thing, because we're seeing all of these Syrian refugees or coming over from Ukraine or those kind of things. So that's another real world issue to deal with there. And I wanted to really explore that in season 13 in a way that I thought the books had touched on, but not really gone too in depth with.
And I think that's one thing that what you did, creating these additional 7 seasons, gives a chance to explore more issues and problems that the original 7 seasons started, and you continued keeping that spirit of the show going.
Yeah. Well, I like to think so. I hope so, certainly.
And then you had your final, the Zero Sum Game, season 14. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that season and made you decide to complete DS9 continuing.
Well, that season was based on 3 novels. By that time, we were back into the flow of the novels again, and they were telling the story for themselves. I didn't really need to fill in any gaps. So it was more like back what I'd done with seasons 8 and 9, where I was just converting the novels, adapting them into screenplays. those novels were about sort of an arms race between the Federation and the Typhon Pact over slipstream drive, which is this new fancy drive technology that Voyager brought back from the Delta Quadrant. And now the Federation has got it, and all of the other people in the Typhon Pact are jealous of that, and they're afraid that the Federation is going to use this new advanced propulsion system to launch a first strike against them, so they want to develop their own version of it, or they might steal the plans from it, or those kind of things. So it was a big arms race there. And that was an interesting story to follow, because we ended up bringing the Dominion into it as well, and various other things, Section 31, all of the various different aspects of the show were all brought together. And when David R. George III wrote those books, the two books that it's mostly based on, which is Plagues of Night and Raise the Dawn, he intended them to function as an ending for the Deep Space Nine story if one was needed. It could also function as another relaunch, a starting of a whole new phase for it, but it was definitely in there that this could be the end if we needed it to be. And some of the novels that had come out after this, I wasn't entirely thrilled with some of the story directions that had been going on. And as we now know, because we've got these new Star Trek shows on TV, the established continuity in the novel line was forced to bring to a close anyway. They wrote the Coda trilogy to end it. So I just thought, well, this is, it's a nice round number. We've had 7 seasons of TV, and now we've had 7 seasons of my scripts as well. So that's just a good place to end it. It was kind of designed to do that anyway. And so I definitely wrote it with the idea of giving all of the continuing characters a conclusion, an end to their story arc, whatever their issues had been as a character, we could resolve them in some way, but then also, again, writing in a restart for them. There's a bit on the very last episode where I say 6 months later, and we see what they're doing in the future. And what they've done is there's a whole new Deep Space Nine. Part of the storyline of it, and why it was so climactic, was that the Deep Space Nine station actually gets destroyed in those books. The Cardassian station doesn't exist anymore. It gets blown up by the Typhon Pact. And so the conclusion of the season is a nice uplifting moment where we've got the brand new Deep Space Nine station.
Now that you mention it, I was reading The Fall One, the Revelation and Dust.
Revelation and Dust, yes.
And I think that was the premiere of the newer station.
Yeah.
That was interesting. I read the books a little out of order, so I didn't really know. I knew the original Deep Space Nine was destroyed, but I just didn't know when. And then I was reading The Fall, Book 1 for the Trek Book Club. From beginning to end, when did you start preparing for season 8, and when did you complete season 14? Because it must have taken a long time, because all the work you do, writing the screenplays, adapting it, writing new stories for to fill in the gaps in the middle of the seasons. Like, how long was it from beginning to end for this project?
Probably about 15 years in total.
Wow. Okay.
I think I started it in 2005, and I just finished season 14 in 2022.
Wow. Okay. I knew it was long. I didn't know it was that long.
Almost twice as long as the show actually takes to see. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Well, I do admire your tenacity and sticking to it, because that is a long time to work on a project like this.
Well, of course, also because I'm doing it all myself. Normally on a TV show, you've got a whole writer's room of people, and then it's not the same person writing one episode and then the next episode and then the next episode. So, yeah, I've got to plan some sort of rough ideas, and then I've got to nail it down into 22 episodes and what exactly each episode is about, and then I've got to actually write the script, and then I've got to go over it several more times and confirm I've got everything right. I give it to my partner to read and see if there's any, anything I've done obviously wrong that I've just not noticed, and spelling mistakes. I'm still finding spelling mistakes. I'm so annoyed at myself after this one.
Actually, one thing I did want to mention was a little bit talking about the characters. There was one that was focusing on Hetik, who was Small Town Boy, which was towards the end, who was Double Boy, I think was his title. So, and I remember he was introduced in earlier book. So, but he was never, I don't think he was ever really on the show. So
No,
I
he
like
wasn't on
that.
the TV show,
TV
definitely. He
show.
was,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I like that you give these characters a chance to be the focus of a story, and that we don't normally see. So I know sometimes in Star Trek itself, there's a more supporting character that becomes the focus. So you were able to do something similar to that. And I know like Quark was a focus, and Garrick had a few, and Sen had a few, and Admiral Akar was also there, and so you were able to spread the stories around and giving everybody a chance to develop.
Yeah, well, I wanted to definitely do that. I haven't really invented a lot of my own characters for this throughout the whole 7 years. There's a small handful, but probably less than 5, that I've actually invented who've become recurring characters. The vast majority of the time, I want to take people who are already there, who've already been created and introduced, and just explore them further, develop them further, see what's going on, what happens next for this person that we already know. And I know a lot of fan fiction writers will like to insert their own characters into the story and that kind of thing. And that was just not what I wanted to do. I wanted it to be, like I say, like just more episodes of the show. So that's what I wrote. But there are a couple of people like Candlewood, like Evik Nath. There's also, I introduced a character in the last season called Ruwogo, and she is the Ferengi exchange officer once the Ferengi join the Kitsma Accords, and she takes over as the chief of security. And I did not create that character. She was actually mentioned in Keith DeCandido's Satisfaction is Not Guaranteed, one of the Worlds of DS9 books. But I brought her in and made her into one of the regular characters of that season. So even though I didn't invent her, I did develop her, and that's mostly what I've done throughout the season, is lots of developing of the already existing characters. And that episode you mentioned there, Small Town Boy, that was definitely Hetik's showpiece there. And like you say, he's a Dabo boy, and I said that he's in a relationship with Candlewood, who's the chief science officer. They were kind of in an on again, off again, constantly falling out and getting back together relationship. And so, I wanted to give him a focus episode. And also Trier. I don't know if you remember Trier, who was the Orion Dabo girl. She's had quite a lot of attention as well. Admiral Akar that you mentioned, there was that episode, The Professionals, where him and Ro resolved their differences once and for all, because that had been established back in the Mission Gamma books that you've read as well, that these two knew each other from their past, but we didn't really get a feel for exactly why they now hated each other. So I wanted to finally resolve that. And the weird thing about that was that those arguments that I'd written between Ro and Akar turned out to be pretty much exactly the same arguments that Ro had with Picard when she had that guest spot on the Picard show. It was almost the same conversation that was happening. So that was interesting.
So you were on the right track already. You just
like
got confirmation on Picard. Speaking of characters, do you have any favorite characters that you enjoyed writing for or expanding their character?
Yeah. I think probably Ro was my favorite. She came on to Deep Space Nine, the station, as the security chief, replacing Odo. And so she had lots of struggles of fitting in to Bajor because she was a non-religious Bajoran. She didn't follow the prophets, and that's obviously not usual for them. So she got a lot of suspicion from the other Bajorans because of that, especially from the Vedeks. And there was a lot of conflict with them. So I found that interesting to write about. But then there was also just her own confidence issues that I found interesting to write about as well. And it quite often came through that I would just like writing for her. There was an episode that would come through and I'd suddenly find myself giving her more and more scenes. And eventually, of course, she became the captain of the station. And that was an interesting arc to see how this person who had been this rebel and misbehavior and always getting into trouble, how she ended up as the captain of one of the most important places in the Federation. So it was just interesting to follow that path. And then I suppose another character that I enjoyed writing for was John Candlewood, who, like I say, became the senior science officer. And in a similar way, he had been mentioned in the early books as one of the junior engineers, just sort of a background name, a nobody. And then suddenly in the later books, he's the chief science officer. So I thought, well, how does that happen? And I have to follow that path through as well. So I wanted to make him quite a distinctive character, and he's gay, he's Jewish, he's an annoying dork who just cannot keep his mouth shut at the worst possible moments. And so I liked writing this kind of quite non-Star Trekky character, non-Starfleety character. He was almost a Lower Decks character before Lower Decks was a thing, with a sort of comic tone of voice almost. But he then has to become more serious and more responsible and actually develop a relationship with Hetik and even take command of the Defiant once or twice. So again, that was interesting to follow that through.
And actually, one thing, I want to talk a little bit about the locations of the seasons, because I noticed DS9 with Ro and Hetik and Candlewood and that group. And then, but we also had not Major Kira anymore, but Vedic Kira on Bajor. And then we also had Cisco on the Robinson. And so in DS9 continuing, this location kind of switched a bit more than maybe in the earlier, because the characters were not all together. They were all having their own arcs and their own development stories.
Well, yeah, that happened as a sort of a natural outcome of the storylines, really, because it had always been a little bit unrealistic, I think, hadn't it, that it was the same crew and that this is supposed to be a military vessel and nothing ever changed for a solid 7, sometimes more years. It was exactly the same people. So in the books, they did advance a bit. Cisco was off on his adventure in the wormhole with the Prophets, so then Kira had to be promoted to take over for him, so she needed a new first officer, and then they all moved on. Kira joined the church instead and became a Vedic, so Vaughn moved up to be captain, and then Vaughn moved on, so Ro moved up to be captain, and then because we're still interested in those people, though, we still want to follow them and see what they're doing out there in the galaxy. So the universe just kind of grew and grew and grew as we added more characters, but still were paying attention to the original characters as well. And then, like you say, there's Cisco on the Robinson, so then he's got his own supporting cast, and there's Dax on the Aventine, she's got her supporting cast. Kira goes down to Bajor, and she's got her people that she's dealing with all of the time. So it just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and so I have to keep track of all of these different people in the different locations. And I think possibly the best example of that is the first half of season 12, because I knew that the second half of season 12 was going to be this one big serialized storyline about the Borg invasion. So the first half of season 12, I made sure wasn't serialized at all. There was lots of standalone episodes and covering all the bases. Check in with the Cardassians, we check in with the Ferengi, we check in with the Andorians. We've got episodes on Bajor, episodes on Earth, episodes on the Aventine, on the Defiant, on the station, jumping around all over the place, like you say, just to keep all of these various plates spinning.
Very interesting how you keep all the plates spinning. So once I understood it's not everything happening on the station, it was interesting seeing how everyone's arc was moving, was proceeding.
A big thing that happens as well in the books and that I've followed through into my scripts is that we start to focus a lot on Federation politics. As you were saying about Articles of the Federation, that's a very political, that's apparently like the West Wing in the Federation. And it's a year in the life of a new Federation president, and we start paying a lot of attention to what's going on at the center of Federation politics and the big events that are out there in the galaxy filtered through that perspective. Because, of course, we've always dealt with the head of the Klingons and the head of the Ferengi and the head of the Romulans and so on, but somehow we've never spent much time with our own head of state. So I think that was the idea behind that was to really spend a lot of time with those people as well, and again, build a whole supporting cast there on Earth.
Martyn, do you have any advice for Trek fans who wanted to explore your site? And I'll put it in the show notes, but the website is www.trekbookclub.com. book.ds9continuing.com. For fans and listeners who wants to explore, do you have any advice on sort of how to dive into the work that you've done?
Well, I can see that it might certainly be a bit overwhelming to look at 163 episodes and stories to read. So, yeah. I would just maybe start at the beginning of any given season rather than halfway through, because the seasons do tend to fall into their own separate storyline. I know that Deep Space Nine, the TV show, didn't quite do that so much. It didn't do like season 5 was one particular story and season 6 was one particular story. It was more flowing than that, but mine are more sort of separated out in that way. Like, for example, Doctor Who or Buffy or Supernatural would just sort of deal with one plot arc per season, and then that's ended, and then the next season is a whole different storyline. So that's probably the easiest way to deal with it, to just come at it from one season at a time, I think.
And it's a little bit like current Star Trek, because Picard season 1, 2, and 3 are all independent. Discovery season 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all independent as well. So similar to that.
But I don't want people to think it's heavily serialized. That's not really what I do. They are still individual episodes, but they build up to an arc over time. Again, much like Deep Space Nine, the show did. That was the style I was going for.
Now that you've looked back at what you've done over the last 15, 16 years, what did you learn about creative process? Would you do something like this again, maybe for a different show, more of a retrospective? How was the whole experience of creating 7 seasons and doing this all by yourself and putting it out there?
Yeah, I think part of the reason I was sort of keeping myself to this DS9 milieu was just maybe out of fear almost, because it was an established property. It was already there for me to work in. I didn't have to create my own stuff quite so much because there was already so much there to work with, and I could just develop off what was already there. So I think what I'd like to do next maybe is create my own stuff more. Well, I don't want to say copy, but definitely develop off other people's work. So I think that's what I'd like to do in the future. Well, I definitely enjoyed myself. It was very intense work at times, like you say, very focused, because I had to keep track of so many different moving pieces. Let's say 163 episodes and over 100 recurring characters. I counted them up. It was over 100. Quite enjoy doing that. I think that was part of what I enjoyed about the novels, the Deep Space Nine novels in the first place, was the building of this growing continuity, this coherent Star Trek universe where all of the different things were all connected and could feed into each other. And I enjoyed taking that on and continuing that into my stories as well. What have I learned in the course of it, I suppose? Just how to write better, just sheerly the practice of it, how to create more interesting characters and how to write, looking at other people's work and me adapting it and seeing what I would have done differently in that situation and changing it for my scripts. That was an interesting exercise to teach myself better how to write, I think, seeing of what other people have done and what I would do differently.
Great. And hopefully you'll get a chance to continue what you've started, maybe creating your own universe or your own stories, different characters.
I'm not sure if I'd still do it in screenplay format because that was quite specific to this. I think I might stick to prose in future. I know that the screenplay format has put a few people off from reading it, that they're just not comfortable with that because they're used to fan fiction being written in prose form and the novels in prose form. And as I said back at the beginning, a lot of the reason I did this was just to sort of teach myself how to do it. The visualization of it, you can almost picture this being another episode of the show and putting the special effects on it and that kind of thing.
When I was reading it in screenplay format, I found it to be a little easier because it was very compressed. So it was easier to read quickly to cover a lot of different episodes. And actually, could you talk a little bit about the reception you've received? Because you mentioned earlier that interacting with the fans, provide feedback or provide their views on this. Maybe talk a little bit about the...
Well, yeah, I've uploaded them onto Trek BBS. put them on there, and I've got some feedback on there, people commenting on them. And I love to get that feedback and talk about the ideas that I've had and get people's responses to that. And yeah, it was very popular at first because, like I say, the fans had been wanting to know what happened. So I was giving them their answer, and they were quite happy about that, to read it. So that I got quite a big following at first. I think it sort of fizzled away a little bit just as things went on. But I still do get regular followers on there, and there's another website called Ad Astra, which is like an archive of our own kind of site where they put fan fiction up, but this is specifically focused on Star Trek. And I upload it on Twitter. I've got my Twitter account, which is just at DS9 Continuing, and I put the links up on there all the time, so I get some comments on there sometimes. And people saying that I've written the characters really well, that they could definitely hear Kira or Dax saying those lines when I was writing them, those kind of things. So yeah, that's nice to hear.
And you could count me as one of those as well, because when I was reading them, I definitely could hear the legacy characters that we saw saying those lines. Was there anything else that we didn't get a chance to cover that you wanted to cover, Martyn?
Think of this as a companion piece to the novels, I suppose, because I don't want people to dismiss the novels, because obviously that's a different format, it's a different medium for the stories to come out in. So I do want people to still read the novels as well. I don't want to take money out of the professional author's hands at all, but it's just coming at those same stories from a different angle, adapting it for the screen. And of course, it's again a different medium there, so you can depict some things visually in a screenplay that you can't in prose. So I would still like to advise people to read the novels.
On a related note, I know DS9 has a bit of a mini revival because Lower Decks did an episode in season 3 that was on DS9. Like you mentioned, we had Coda, which brought back some of the DS9 characters. Unfortunately, it was the end of the era of the Litverse. Hopefully we can see DS9 in some way, shape, or form in the future. Lower Decks might review it again or something.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'd love for people to animate these scripts if they could and do the voiceovers for it. So I'm sure that's probably not going to happen.
You mentioned Babylon 5. I know Babylon 5 has an animated movie that's coming out.
Yes, I haven't seen that yet. I want to, definitely.
And I think with Star Trek, franchise is a little bit in flux right now because Picard ended, Discovery's ending, Prodigy as well is left Paramount. So there's a lot of flux, but I'm hoping that Star Trek Legacy, which actually Picard Season 3 brought a little bit of DS9 characters, even if they're references, but they brought some themes back.
And Section 31 again, didn't it? That kind of thing,
Yeah, and with the changelings, and Ro came back for that one episode, which was really good. So
that was fantastic. I loved that.
Yeah. So hopefully, we haven't seen the end of DS9 in some way.
Unfortunately, of course, a couple of the cast have died now, haven't they? So that's not going to be easy to replace them.
Yeah, that's true. So it'll be harder. That may be, animation, while not ideal, I know probably like live action, but animation may be the best going forward, similar to what Babylon 5, because several members of the main cast died in Babylon 5 over the years as well. So well, thank you very much, Martyn, for being a guest on the podcast. I had a fun time reading your DS9 continuing screenplays and talking with you about all the work that you did. So can you let our listeners know the best way to contact you to continue the conversation? And if there's any projects you're working on that you'd like to share with the audience?
They're welcome to come to my Twitter account, which is at DS9 Continuing. The 9 is the numeral 9, so the capitals DS9 Continuing. And they're welcome to contact me through there. If they go on to the website, which again is just ds9continuing.com, then again, there's my Twitter link on there and email if they want to contact me through there. As to what I'm working on now, I am trying to get around to write a novel. It was one of those situations where I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning and suddenly had an idea for a book. And so I wrote 1,000 words straight away at 3 o'clock in the morning just to get the idea down on paper. And now I'm trying to actually flesh that out into a novel. And that's not sci-fi related at all. That's more just sort of a nice gentle romance story. So I'm trying to broaden my palette a little bit by doing that. But yes, I'd love to hear from people. I want to hear reviews. I want to hear people have conversations with me about these stories, because I like doing that when the books have come out. Certainly, again, on Trek BBS, on Twitter with you, with the Trek Book Club. I like to have those conversations with people, so I'd love to have it about my own stories.
I just wanted to mention that we actually first connected, I believe, when the Trek Book Club was discussing Avatar, books 1 and 2. This was, I think, 2+ years ago. And I remember you were really giving in-depth background information, connections, providing more information about the DS9 universe, because that was actually my first foray into the relaunch novels for DS9. So I remember that you were very helpful in helping facilitating some of the conversations and chiming in at some of the other members when they were asking questions about the DS9 relaunch era, which I didn't really know. You knew it very well, so I appreciate that.
Well, that's the thing. Having read through them so many times to adapt them into screenplays, I know them pretty much off by heart now. I could probably answer any question you wanted to ask about them, although maybe I shouldn't say that. That's too much of a challenge now. You'll prove me wrong. But yes, I do know them very well.
So that's great. I appreciate that. So thank you. For me, my contact information, I'm on Twitter. It's at PeterTrek1, the number 1. I also have a short form Star Trek solo cast, which is called My Star Trek Life on Spotify. So the link is on Twitter profile as well. You can also contact Trek Book Club. It's at Trek Book Club on Twitter, where we read Star Trek books and discuss one approximately once every 1.5 months over a weekend. Okay, so thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martyn, for taking the time and talking about DS9 Continuing. And I encourage our listeners to check out the website, ds9continuing.com. You could also connect with Martyn on Twitter as well and learn about this very expansive era of DS9 that's available. This is Peter signing off. Live long and prosper.
Thank you. Bye-bye.